You'd think the smell of fresh candles might be pleasant until they're made from tallow and stored next to pickled eels. I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight you'll inhale the mixed bouquet of Victorian commerce smoke brine and soap flakes. With just a hint of mildew, oil lamps hiss, leather aprons creak, barrels bulge with flour fish, licorice root, and pickled onions. It's a curious world of textures and odors where the layout of a small general shop tells you everything about its priorities. Why did some keep salt near the sweets? And what happened if vinegar leaked? If you're enjoying the scent of quiet history mixed with faintly spoiled food, maybe leave a like and subscribe. It helps me keep the lantern burning. Tell me what's the strangest historical smell you'd be oddly curious to experience. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The door creaks open. Your boots scuff across grooved floorboards worn by 100 anxious shoppers. Immediately, your nose is struck. Salted herring coal soot, the sharp tang of soap, and a faint undercurrent of old wood soaked in oil. It's a peculiar harmony. But to a Victorian shopkeeper, this is the smell of homework and survival. General shops were small, often just one room wide and a room or two deep. But they overflowed with goods. Shelves bowed under tins of mustard, thread spools, buttons, barley tins of treacle, and packets of herbal pills. Each shelf was like a paragraph in a strange domestic novel. Hanging from hooks, above rolled carpets, smoked meats, brushes and umbrellas close enough to bonk your head if you weren't careful. The counter formed the beating heart of this small kingdom. Usually oak, sometimes scrubbed pine, it was worn smooth by coin after coin. Behind it stood the shopkeeper, part salesman, part accountant, part social referee. The scales sat nearby, brass or cast iron, accompanied by a drawer of small weights, ready to portion out everything from sugar to soap flakes. Nothing was prepackaged. Every sale was an act of weighing, scooping, wrapping, and scribbling. And every mistake, too much flour, too little change, was a potential insult. Lighting was dim, but crucial. Before gaslight reached most shops, they used oil lamps, which hissed and flickered and spat if the wick was trimmed wrong. Soot smeared the low ceiling. Glass chimneys had to be cleaned daily, and some shopkeepers kept rags in their apron just for that purpose. A poorly cleaned lamp made customers squint, and squinting made them grumpy. Now let's talk about smell again, because Victorian shops weren't just seen and heard, they were sniffed. Candles especially, the cheap tallow ones gave off a rancid beefy funk. Next to those sat barrels of salted eels, which had their own pungent perfume. Flour dust clung to every surface, mingling with smoke from a nearby hearth or chimney. If you were lucky, the scent of fresh bread drifted in from a nearby bakery. If you were less lucky, the smell of wet wool or fish guts clung to customers as they browsed. Clothing was a part of the aroma, too. Shopkeepers often wore thick leather aprons to protect from spills and sparks, and over time these aprons developed a scent all their own, a mix of wax sweat and daily life. Customers might wear perfume, or they might not. And remember, bathing was not a daily habit for many Victorians. A hot day. Things could get fragrant. Store hygiene varied widely. Some kept things neat and polished floors swept and counters tidy. Others let dust settle and jars go sticky. There's still scholarly disagreement over how clean these shops actually were. Some accounts describe spotless order. Others suggest roaches and soot and corners best left unexplored. One customer's homey was another's filthy. It depended on the day and the shopkeeper's standards. Still, these smells became part of the identity. Children grew up recognizing the tang of penny soap and the sweet whiff of barley sugar. They associated the sharp snap of vinegar corks with supper and the crackle of wrapping paper with treats snuck in pockets. These shops weren't sterile, they were alive. No fragrance was wasted. Every corner, every barrel, every apron told a story. The sun isn't up yet, but you are. Your feet find the cold floorboards before your mind catches up. There's no alarm clock, just habit a distant rooster, and the knowledge that shutters don't open themselves. Outside, the street is still wrapped in blue twilight. You unlatch the front door and push open the heavy wooden shutters with a creak that sets off a dog barking 2 doors down. Coal dust clings to the stoop from last night's carts. You sweep it away with brisk practice strokes, the bristles of your broom worn to a fan. This is your second broom this year. The first gave out in April. Inside, a kettle rests on the iron stove ready to be lit. You flick a match and feel the satisfying whoosh of flame catching. Soon the air smells like strong tea and singed paper, a comforting blend that anchors your morning routine. One hand stirs the pot, while the other fingers a soft leather ledger cracked and ink smudged from years of use. You count yesterday's coin. Most of it's in halfpennies and farthings. Not much to show, but it'll do for now. 6 a.m. is not early for a Victorian shopkeeper. It's standard. In cities, some opened even before that. In rural villages, especially during harvest season, the shutters lifted as early as 4:30 or 5. Customers came on foot by cart or with sleepy toddlers in tow. Farmers wanted their flour. Housewives needed yeast. Children came clutching copper coins, eyes bright with dreams of barley sugar or licorice twists. You had to be ready. Breakfast. Only if it fits between deliveries. A heel of bread dunked in tea. Maybe a piece of cheese left from last night's supper. If your stomach growls, you ignore it. What matters is the first hour of trade. It sets the tone for everything that follows. Get behind in the morning, and you'll chase your tail until night. Opening the shop meant more than lifting a latch. You had to light the lamps, wipe the counter, straighten the jars. The jars mattered: clear glass for sweets, thick crockery for pickles and powders. Their alignment spoke volumes. A wonky jar could earn you side-eye from Mrs. Ponsby, who believed order reflected moral character. She wasn't entirely wrong. Inventory had to be checked too. Not with scanners or spreadsheets, but by eye, by memory, and sometimes by sniff. Is the molasses still good? Are the eggs fresh? You tap each one gently and listen for a hollow rattle. If the butter has gone sour, there's no hiding it. Some shopkeepers scribbled notes on scraps of butcher paper. Others trusted their heads. And some, those with ambition, wrote it all in ledgers, columns, neat as soldiers. But the ledgers don't always tell the full truth. Some lines are rewritten. Some debts forgotten. A few shopkeepers, especially the older ones, invented their own shorthand to keep prying eyes out. Researchers today still puzzle over some of these codes. Was FD flour delivered or final debt? Was the tiny triangle in the margin a symbol for spoiled goods or for Mrs. Ponsby's penchant for bargaining? You wear many hats before breakfast: cleaner, clerk, cook, and sometimes peacekeeper. If a customer arrives already sour, muttering about milk prices or slights from neighbors, you smile and nod. Listening is part of the trade. So is deflection. You can't afford to offend a regular, especially one with a long memory and a long line of gossip behind her. Even at this hour, the street outside is beginning to wake. Hooves clop, wheels squeak. Somewhere a bell rings. The day is unfolding, and you've already lived a dozen tiny lives before most people open their eyes. You wipe your hands on your apron and glance at the brass scales, your most trusted tool and occasional nemesis. Their arms tremble with precision. A quarter-pound of sugar weighed just right can mean the difference between a satisfied customer and a reputation in tatters. Your first buyer of the day stands before you, a boy no older than 8, clutching a grubby coin and reciting a list from memory. Sugar, soap, 2 ounces of tea, leaves not the dusty kind. You nod, reach for the tin, and measure carefully. The sugar comes first. You lift the scoop, let it cascade into the paper twist, then set the packet on the scale. A hair too heavy, you pinch a few grains back. Too light, you add a whisper more. Precision is an art, and your audience is watching. In Victorian shops, sugar was among the most common purchases, not just because people craved sweets, but because nearly everything porridge tea bread was made bearable by its presence. Yet sugar wasn't just scooped casually. It was weighed with ceremony. Your scales polished weekly with vinegar, and cloth bear witness to every exchange. Their counterweights, tiny brass domes stamped with their value, are laid out like chess pieces. Credit is the quiet current running beneath all of this. Most customers can't pay for everything outright. So you jot their debts in the ledger with a stubby pencil, careful to mark who owes what. Some will pay Friday. Some won't. You learn their rhythms, their honesty, their excuses. A smudge by a name might mean trouble. A double underline might mean trust. But nothing is guaranteed. One bad harvest or illness and a regular might vanish debt unpaid. And then there's the haggling. Victorian shopkeepers had to master the subtle art of denial with a smile. Surely not 6pence for this, a customer might protest, holding up a tin of polish. You shrug, remind them gently of supply costs and the weather that delayed delivery. Sometimes they grumble. Sometimes they leave. Sometimes they pay more than they should, then complain to their neighbor. And that, too, finds its way back to your ears. You do your best. You smile. You measure, you write. But mistakes happen. A misweighed ounce, a misheard order, a page turned too far in the ledger. These aren't just errors, they're risks. A scolding from a customer can spread through the town faster than lamp oil on linen. Worse, your books might not balance at the end of the week. And when they don't, you'll lie awake retracing numbers, wondering who got an extra halfpenny's worth of barley. Historians still puzzle over some surviving ledgers. The numbers don't always add up. Pages are torn. Totals are scratched out and rewritten. Were they honest mistakes, quiet cover-ups, or clever bookkeeping in hard times? There's no consensus, but to you, each entry is a memory. A scoop of flour for the widowed Mrs. Darnley. A penny sweet for young George, who always says thank you. A loan to the blacksmith who never forgets his debts. You don't just trade goods. You trade trust day after day, weighed out like sugar, precisely, precariously, and always with care. There's a distant clatter, hoofbeats on cobbles, the rhythmic groan of wooden wheels, and you know it's coming before the dray horse even rounds the corner. Twice a week, like clockwork, your lifeline arrives with the creak of leather harnesses and a driver in a battered cap. The delivery cart is a lumbering beast of burden, pulled by a single draft horse whose name you've never learned, but whose flatulence is legend. The driver jumps down with a grunt, and thuds open the cart's back panel, revealing a miniature warehouse on wheels. Burlap sacks, wooden crates, stacked tins, and glass bottles nestled in straw. You wave, and he waves back without looking. You've both done this too many times. Supplies come from the nearby depot or rail station, flour beans, candles, dried fruit, paraffin biscuits in tins as tall as your knees. The flour sacks are always the heaviest, and today they're damp from morning drizzle, which means their contents will clump and spoil faster. You sigh, but what can be done? The drayman shrugs in that particular way. That means, not my problem. Victorian shop deliveries weren't glamorous. They were grubby, sweaty affairs. No forklifts, no gloves, just burlap under fingernails and bruised shins from crates misjudged. You and the drayman drag sacks into the storeroom, checking each one off the list scratched in pencil. You count tins, sniff casks for spoilage, and frown at one that reeks faintly of vinegar. A broken pickle jar, probably. Some goods arrive only seasonally, like imported citrus or new bonnet ribbons. When they do, it's cause for quiet celebration. Children gather around the cart wide-eyed. Mothers whisper about whether the oranges are real or just dyed turnips, like that infamous April shipment. You once had a customer bite into a bitter almond soap, thinking it was marzipan. She never returned. Weather plays its own cruel tricks. On wet days, everything comes soaked. On hot days, butter melts in transit. And sometimes, most maddening of all, boxes go missing. Did they fall from the cart? Were they stolen? No one ever admits fault. There are whispers among shopkeepers of rivalries of carts intercepted, of contents mysteriously redirected. But the records are silent on these little dramas. Historians still debate how frequent such thefts really were. Some think it was rare. Others believe it was quietly common, a fact everyone accepted, but no one spoke aloud. Once the goods are inside, the sorting begins. Sacks to the back, perishables up front, broken jars repurposed for storage. You unwrap a new delivery of peppermint lozenges and arrange them in the glass jar just so. If you're lucky, you get a chipped one for yourself. The rest are off limits until paid for. No sampling, even if they sparkle temptingly in the morning light. As the drayman mounts his cart and flicks the reins, the horse snorts and shuffles forward, leaving behind a trail of hoof prints and flour dust. You shut the door behind him, already thinking ahead to where everything must go. The shop has no stockroom manager, no schedule. Just you, your judgment, and whatever your back can carry. And still, each barrel placed and shelf-stocked carries the quiet rhythm of control. In a world of chaos, at least this much is yours to order. The sunlight outside may be golden, but your windows catch only the grime. A film of soot dulls the glass, courtesy of passing carriages and coal smoke that never quite settles. You sigh, grab a rag, and begin the ritual dance of polishing what the city refuses to keep clean. Victorian shopfronts were a balance of presentation and practicality. Your windows, though small by modern standards, are your advertisement. Behind them, glass jars glint with barley sugar. A loaf of bread, a tin of polish, and a carefully folded handkerchief sit in a modest arrangement. It's not opulent, but it suggests care. A cracked window pane, however, tells a different story: neglect, hardship, or worse. Customers notice. They always notice. Cleaning isn't just cosmetic. Coal soot seeps into cracks. Dust clings to every sign, every letter in your painted slogan above the door. Fine provisions and sundries. You once paid a boy a farthing to repaint the ampersand. Now it's half faded again, victim to rain and pigeons. The lamps, those cranky little guardians of the doorway, must be cleaned too. Each evening, you trim their wicks. Each morning, you wipe their chimneys. Oil is messy, and the residue clings to hands' aprons, even your eyebrows if you get too close. Glass repairs are especially fraught. Some say it's men's work, strong arms for lifting, steady hands for puttying. Others insist it's women who handled it, especially in shops run by widows or spinsters. Surviving records offer conflicting accounts. In one town, a woman named Letty patched a dozen panes herself over 20 years. In another, a male carpenter charged triple the going rate because shops weren't meant for hammers. Scholars still argue whether there was a true division of labor or just stories repeated until they felt like truth. But it's not just windows. Every surface in your shop begs attention. The floorboards collect mud. The shelves grow sticky. The counters acquire mysterious fingerprints no matter how often you wipe. Even the ceiling, not often noticed, develops drips and smudges, especially near the stovepipe. And don't forget the bell over the door. It's small brass and slightly dented, but it's your signal. Every time it jingles, you straighten up, smile, and pretend you weren't scrubbing a grease stain the size of whales. Of course, no amount of tidying can save you from the occasional disaster. A boy once knocked over a jar of licorice root. It shattered, scattering sticky shards and black spirals across the floor. Another time, a stray cat darted in during a thunderstorm and leapt straight into the flour sack. You didn't sell flour that week. Still, cleanliness is part of your identity. A clean shop says I care. A clean window says trust me. And for customers, balancing tight purses and tighter schedules, that trust matters, even if it's only clean for the first hour of the day, before the boots come in, before the soot returns, before the jars fog with condensation. It still counts. Because every pane polished, every lamp lit, every smudge erased is a small defiance against the creeping chaos of the world. And though the grime always returns, so do you, rag in hand, ready to fight it back again. Push aside the faded curtain at the back of the shop, and you're no longer a merchant, you're home. Sort of. The scent of candles and vinegar gives way to cabbage stew and damp wool. You're still on duty, of course, but now your customer is a leaking ceiling and a toddler with jam hands. Living behind or above the shop was the norm for Victorian shopkeepers. Space was precious. Efficiency was king. A narrow doorway, sometimes hidden behind a sack of potatoes, led to a corridor, a tiny kitchen, and a staircase that groaned like a ghost with bad knees. You don't just sleep near your work, you breathe it in. Always. Even your dreams have ledgers in them. The kitchen might have a coal range, a water jug, and 3 mismatched plates. Maybe a tin bathtub, pushed into the corner, its enamel chipped. You boil water on a good day. On bad days, you sponge bathe from a basin while shouting at your youngest to stop chasing the cat. The pantry is a single shelf. You live among tins meant to be sold and spoons that keep disappearing. One of the children swears the ghost upstairs is taking them. You're not entirely sure he's wrong. Upstairs, the rooms are smaller still. Low ceilings, narrow beds. If you sit up too fast, you risk a cracked skull. The wallpaper peels at the corners and curls like old parchment. You've patched it twice. The hallway holds a chest of drawers that also holds the entire family's socks. They're never the same length, and nobody remembers why. Children grow up between the shop's rhythms. They run from the front counter to the stew pot, dodging customers and half-sorted deliveries. They know not to touch the vinegar bottles but sometimes do. They know which drawers squeak and which don't. The youngest once tried to weigh his pet mouse on the shop scale. You didn't stop him. It was a slow day. Family life overlaps with commerce in strange, cozy, chaotic ways. Your spouse might be folding laundry next to the pickle barrel. Your eldest reads a book in the stairwell while you debate bacon prices with a clergyman. The dog naps beside a sack of barley. And when supper's ready, you call out over the counter, close the door behind you, whether addressing a customer or your daughter. Historians differ on how to interpret this domestic entanglement. Some view it as intimate and efficient, a family living in harmony with their trade. Others see it as claustrophobic, a blurring of work and rest that left no space for privacy. Letters from the time offer both views. One widow wrote, "I've not been alone since 1847. Another called her home shop arrangement a comfort like a woolen sock for the soul. But the curtain stays. It's not just a fabric divider, it's the threshold between roles. Merchant and mother, shopkeeper and soup stirrer. When you draw it closed even for a moment, you carve out something precious, a line, however thin, between public service and private life. And that line, for all its creases, is sacred. The noon bell doesn't ring, but your stomach does. It's an ungraceful reminder that the last thing you ate was a crust of bread, around 6 hastily chewed, while calculating how many candles you could sell before dusk. Now it's midday, and lunch is aspirational. There's no lunch break in your world. Meals are slotted between transactions fitted into silences. One moment you're weighing oats, the next you're lifting a pot lid with your elbow to check if the stew's still warm. If it is, congratulations, you eat. If it isn't, well, there's always tomorrow. A typical lunch for a Victorian shopkeeper wasn't grand. A hunk of cheese, perhaps cut with a knife that also sliced string. A boiled potato, gone cold and waxy, eaten over a ledger. Maybe some stale bread dipped into whatever's still wet on the stove. If you're lucky, yesterday's stew hasn't turned. If you're very lucky, someone else remembered to cover it. No refrigerators, of course. At best, you had a pantry tucked near the coolest wall. Some kept perishables in earthenware crocks, others wrapped food in damp cloths and prayed. Butter melted, milk soured. Meat. Well, let's not discuss what meat did. If you had money, you might own an icebox stocked with a block bought weekly from a passing vendor. If you didn't, you improvised cellars, shady shelves, or just wishful thinking. The shop doesn't stop for meals either. As you chew, customers appear. You learn to speak around bites, to swallow fast, to hide your plate under the counter when the squire's wife enters. Etiquette demanded a clean apron, not a gravy-stained one. So you dab at your collar and pray the bread crust stuck to your teeth doesn't show when you smile. Sometimes lunch was social. A quick chat with the drayman as you shared a heel of bread. Sometimes it was solitary, a quiet moment behind the curtain, while someone else minded the counter. More often, it was interrupted. A broken jar. A customer wanting matches. A child shouting that the cat's knocked over the vinegar. And the cat, yes, the cat. Every shop had one, sometimes two. Ostensibly, for catching mice, but more often for knocking over tins and stealing bites from the stew when your back was turned. Rats were a real problem. They gnawed at flour sacks, darted along shelves, and occasionally made themselves known with a squeak during prayer. Diaries mention them frequently, sometimes with humor, sometimes with horror. One entry reads simply, "Rats in the oats again." Consider moving to Wales. Some scholars suggest that Victorian shopkeepers developed a sort of sixth sense for food spoilage, able to smell when potatoes had gone off or jam had fermented just enough to become dangerous. Others believe they simply built up an iron constitution or learned to chew very, very carefully. So you eat what you can when you can. And if you find yourself chewing something mysterious and slightly chewy, you probably don't ask what it is. You just keep chewing, wash it down with tea, and hope the next customer is too distracted to notice the jam on your chin. The door jingles open, and you brace yourself, not for a customer, but for the street itself. The air rushes in with all its commotion barking dogs, a harmonica tune drifting from somewhere you can't see, and the unmistakable squeak of a chimney sweep's ladder scraping brick. Life outside your Victorian shop isn't quiet. It's a swirling theater of characters, each louder than the last. Stray dogs loiter near the bakery for scraps their noses dusted in flour. Boys sell newspapers with voices that could rattle glass. Street singers warble half-forgotten ballads, hoping for coins tossed from second-story windows. One woman sells hot potatoes from a cart. Another mends stockings on a stool. And all of them, at some point, have lingered near your shop's threshold. You don't just coexist with this chaos. You participate in it. For all your inventory of biscuits and barley, you've also sold penny sheet songs, hand-printed in smudgy ink. You've patched umbrellas for a few farthings. You've even bartered buttons for a story or two. This is more than commerce. It's survival by mosaic tiny trades, stacked like bricks, into a day that pays for dinner. Victorian shopkeepers weren't just shopkeepers. They were tinkerers, sellers, fixers, and on occasion, informal pawnbrokers. A child needs boots, but has no coin. You might accept a jar of jam in exchange. A ballad seller wants a pie. You swap it for the latest verse about Queen Victoria's corgis. Some of these side hustles were clever adaptations. Others were desperate flailing. Historians still debate whether this multiplicity of roles was entrepreneurial genius or forced labor under economic strain. Your shop doesn't have a second floor of fine goods or a staff of uniformed clerks. It has you. And on Tuesdays, it also has a jug band that plays outside your window until someone pays them to leave. You've timed them. 13 minutes is their limit before your nerves fray. Then there's the barter culture. Neighbors trade cabbage for candles. A passing fiddler leaves a song in exchange for tea. You once acquired a chicken by accident. It wandered in during a rainstorm, pecked a biscuit, and refused to leave. The children named it Queen Peckabeth. It lived in the back stairwell for weeks. Evening brings a different crowd. Drunken singers. Arguments. A constable who tips his hat, but never lingers. The shadows stretch long, and you double-check that the bolts on the door slide easily. The world outside might entertain, but it never stops pressing in. There's no insulation from the street, no double glazing or zoning laws. Your shop is a sieve through which life pours freely, sometimes annoyingly, sometimes beautifully. And though the noise steals your peace, it also keeps you company. Because in the end, even a soft life needs a little ruckus to remind it that it's real. The pencil you use is no longer a full pencil. It's a stub worn down until it barely fits between your fingers. You've sharpened it with a knife so often that its wood is jagged, and yet somehow it still works. Just barely. The stub writes your life. Ledgers are your constant companion. Their pages hold more than numbers. They hold trust habits, grudges. Each line tells a story. Mrs. Bramley 3 candles owed Sudie. Mr. Collins Tobacco, again no payment. You track sales credit barters and promises all in pencil so you can erase what needs forgetting. The ink is for names that won't change. The rest is always in flux. Your handwriting isn't elegant, it's functional. Curled letters, abbreviations, little squiggles that only you understand. You've developed a shorthand that feels like a secret language. SS means soap scraps. A triangle by a name might mean unreliable. Or it might mean they bring you biscuits at Christmas. You're not even sure anymore. Victorian shopkeepers had no tills, with receipts, no calculators. Everything was handwritten. Tallies were done by eye additions, by mental arithmetic. Errors were frequent. Sometimes you catch them. Sometimes they catch you. And sometimes nobody notices at all. Researchers still study these ledgers. Some pages show blatant manipulation numbers scratched out and rewritten columns suddenly unbalanced. Were they accidents, intentional fudges, or desperate attempts to stay afloat? There is no scholarly consensus. Some suggest shopkeepers altered books to cover losses. Others believe the chaos was simply the cost of doing business with a pencil and hope. You keep your books hidden behind the counter, not locked, just folded shut with a certain gravity. The pages are smudged with flour grease, maybe a teardrop, from a day when the sums didn't sum. You try to balance them weekly. But there are days, many days, when balance is more spiritual than numerical. Children occasionally ask what you're writing. You tell them secrets, which isn't a lie. One page records the time you gave bread away after a flood. Another shows the debt you quietly forgave when old Mr. Dobbins lost his wife. You've scribbled jokes in the margins. Once you drew a cat wearing spectacles. No one else will see these things, but they make the pages yours. And when the day is long, and your back aches, and your sales barely cover the soap you use to clean the floor, you still pick up that stubby pencil, because recording it makes it real. And even if no one else reads it, the ledger remembers. The bell over the door jingles again, but it's not always about sugar or soap. Sometimes a customer doesn't want to buy anything. They just want to talk, or whisper, or sigh loudly until you ask what's wrong. And then the floodgates open. Gossip flows through your shop, like tea from a cracked kettle spilling everywhere never quite contained. Mrs. Harbottle heard that Mr. Pilling's daughter is in a delicate condition. Young Tom was seen loitering near the grocer's chickens. The vicar's sermon was too long. The milkman is too friendly. You nod, make vague sounds, and keep wrapping barley. Victorian shopkeepers often doubled as informal town therapists, political commentators, and dispute referees. You were a fixed point in a shifting world, a listening ear wedged between jars of sweets and boxes of starch. People brought their coins, yes, but also their complaints, their questions, and their carefully folded notes for others. Sometimes it's harmless, a bit of back fence talk. Other times, it's more pointed. Who's behind on rent? Who owes who a chicken? That's not a metaphor. Actual poultry has changed hands to settle debts, and you've been asked more than once to confirm it happened. One man insisted his neighbor borrowed a goose under false pretenses. You stayed neutral. News, too, enters by word of mouth. You might hear of a fire 2 towns over before it reaches the papers, or that a baby was born with a full head of red hair scandalous, given both parents are fair. People use your counter as a confession box, a soapbox, and a stage. You've learned to nod without committing to say how interesting in 3 different tones depending on the danger level. Not all conversations are local. Customers bring you news of distant wars, parliamentary shifts, price changes in coal, a new type of corset. They parrot headlines they barely understand. You absorb them all, a living newspaper with a lopsided apron. Some shopkeepers wrote these stories down carefully, noting names and quotes. Others let them float past like dust. Researchers today study those notes and diaries, trying to piece together local moods from scattered mentions. But there's still no agreement on how influential shopkeepers truly were in shaping opinion. Some say they were passive observers. Others say they were the heartbeat of a town's collective mind. You try not to take sides. Mostly. But it's hard when you've known these people for years. You remember when the fishmonger's daughter stole licorice, when the blacksmith cried after his mother died, when Mrs. Harbottle lost her third baby and still brought you wildflowers a week later. You remember everything, and you forget what needs forgetting. Complaints are trickier. People feel safe complaining in shops. About prices, neighbors' politics weather the lace on the bishop's sleeves. You learn to absorb it like flour into dough. Too much salt, and it won't rise. Too little, and it's bland. You mix and knead until it holds shape. That's the art. And when the bell rings again, you brace for more. Not because you dread it, but because somewhere, in all that muttering and murmuring, there's truth. Hidden between exaggerations and raised eyebrows, there's something real. And if you're patient, it'll find you. The boy stomps in first, boots caked in mud pockets, jangling with something he definitely shouldn't be selling. Behind him floats a lady in gloves so spotless you suspect they've never touched a doorknob. You greet them both with the same practiced smile, but you already know this transaction will be a performance. Customer service in your Victorian shop isn't just politeness, it's pageantry. For the laborer's son, you use firm tones and pointed questions. For the squire's wife, you adopt a subtle deference, careful not to suggest that her choice of biscuit is anything less than majestic. The dance is ancient. The roles are well rehearsed. Social class touches every part of your job. The wealthy speak more slowly, use more syllables, and never carry their own purchases. Their items are wrapped in extra paper. Their change is handed with a slight bow. The poor, your most frequent and loyal patrons, bring coppers wrapped in cloth and accept their parcels in hand. You don't treat them worse. You treat them differently. Because if you don't, the lady in gloves might mention something unfortunate to her husband at the next parish meeting. Aprons matter too. You have 3. One for cleaning, one for normal use, and one for high society. It's starched, barely creased, and worn only when necessary. It does nothing to protect your clothes, but it protects your dignity. You once wore the wrong apron to greet a visiting magistrate's wife. She looked at your buttons like they were contagious. Children present their own challenge. Boys with muddy boots often treat the shop like a playground. You learn to spot the ones who will pocket a licorice twist if given the chance. Girls, especially those sent by mothers with exact change, stand still as statues, but eye every sweet jar like it's the throne of heaven. Occasionally, you let one choose a barley sugar from the broken jar. It's not charity, it's reputation maintenance. Etiquette is so complex, it could be a second language. You don't just hand things to customers, you offer them. You don't just correct errors, you gently suggest alternatives. Might I recommend the lavender starch? It holds better in damp weather. That's shopkeeper code for the other one will rot your collars. Historians disagree on how shopkeepers felt about all this theater. Some diaries hint at quiet resentment. Others reveal pride in knowing exactly how to walk the social tightrope. A few outright mock their betters in margins too faded for most eyes. The truth, as always, is likely a mix of duty exhaustion and a strange affection for the daily absurdities of class. And then there are the in-betweens, those rising in station newly dressed in lace, but still paying in installments. They're the hardest to read, balancing old habits with new expectations. One minute they haggle, the next they complain the soap smells too common. You keep your face neutral and your ledger open. But behind the counter, you see it all: pride, wrapped in kid gloves, mischief under muddy caps, and hope pressed into your palm with every coin, clean or grubby. Sunday arrives, not with trumpets or relief, but with silence, a thick, echoing quiet that settles over the shop like dust on a high shelf. The shutters stay closed. The till sleeps. And for once, you don't light the lamps. You just lie there, eyes tracing the ceiling's familiar cracks, wondering how long you can go without moving. Victorian shopkeepers were often allowed just one day off a week, if that. Sunday was sacred in more than just the religious sense. It was the only time you weren't required to smile, measure, or sweep. Some shopkeepers used the day for prayer, others for cleaning. A few, the wisest perhaps, did absolutely nothing. You try to join their ranks, but even doing nothing takes effort. The children still need breakfast. The cat still expects attention. The stew still needs stirring. And the ceiling, well, it seems to be forming a new crack just beside the old one, shaped like a goose. You'll have to keep an eye on that. You used to spend Sundays writing letters. Now the pen feels too heavy. You consider reading, but your book is propping up the broken table leg. Besides, your eyes don't want to focus. So you sit. You stare. And slowly, deliciously, you begin to float in the molasses-thick quiet of your one true rest. Some shopkeepers took long walks on Sundays just to remind themselves there was a world beyond vinegar and barley. Others sewed patched or planned inventory. And some, those lucky or irreverent enough, snuck a nap behind the curtain, the kind that makes your mouth go dry and your neck regret everything. Whether these naps were acceptable is still debated. One pamphlet from the time called Sunday idleness a moral failing. Another called it an act of quiet protest. There is no consensus. You've tried both approaches. Sometimes you fold laundry. Sometimes you fold your arms and refuse to move. One Sunday, you traced every knot in the wooden ceiling until you fell asleep, imagining they were constellations. You dreamed of stars made of biscuit crumbs and galaxies shaped like soup bowls. Religion may be the stated reason for the pause, but rest is its own devotion. In a week of serving others, this is the one day you serve your own stillness. And though the clock ticks just as loudly, you measure time differently, by size, by the settling of dust, by the slow curl of steam from a forgotten cup of tea. Outside, the world goes quiet too. Fewer carts, fewer bells. Even the dogs seem to know it's not a day for barking. Someone plays a hymn on a cracked harmonium 3 doors down. It sounds like it's being played underwater. You smile. It's terrible. It's perfect. And when dusk comes, you don't dread the coming Monday. Not yet. You stretch, adjust your cushion, and allow yourself one last lazy thought: I should fix that ceiling tomorrow. Maybe. There's nothing extravagant about your life. No golden clocks, no satin gloves, no towering puddings with sugar flowers. But now and then, when the till balances and the biscuits haven't gone stale, you indulge, not with grandeur, with a spoonful of strawberry jam. Victorian shopkeepers learned to cherish small luxuries: a new spoon, a handkerchief without holes, a moment of stillness with a cup of tea so hot it warms your teeth. These weren't treats so much as secret affirmations that the grind hadn't swallowed you whole. You didn't need champagne. You just needed the jam. You keep a few treasures tucked away. A tin of boiled sweets never meant to be sold. A bolt of fabric you touch every time the rent is paid on time. A pencil with a full eraser too precious to use. You're not greedy, but you are human. And in a world where your apron is often your napkin, your ledger, and your shield, a tiny delight is a rebellion. Some shopkeepers hid these luxuries from even their families. Others shared them with knowing winks. One diary mentions a man who once a month used the good tea leaves twice. Another woman saved broken biscuits in a special tin and gave them only to the kindest children. A third sewed a lace edge into her nightcap, not visible to anyone but herself. Historians still debate whether these small acts were personal joys or quiet signals to the world I matter to. You once spent an entire afternoon arranging a display of combs you knew wouldn't sell just because their shell pattern made you feel calmer. You keep a small sprig of lavender in the drawer with your ledgers. It doesn't smell anymore, but it looks like peace. And yes, you once bought a tin whistle for a child who sang to the cat. It cost more than it should have. You wrapped it in brown paper and told her it was from St. Nicholas, even though it was May. She played it until it drove the entire shop mad. You'd do it again. Because joy in your world isn't loud. It's soft and crumb-sized. It lives in the corner behind the curtain, in the quiet between customers, in the satisfaction of saving one perfect item for yourself. And when the shutters close and the lamp glows low, you take out the jam, the spoon, the sweet. You savor it slowly, knowing it won't last. But for that moment, the world is just right. There's a cough you've been ignoring for weeks, dry, persistent, lingering. You blame the soot, the damp, the chill. But this morning your hand trembles as you try to lift the kettle. And for the first time, you consider something terrifying, putting out the open sign and leaving it down. When a Victorian shopkeeper fell ill, the whole system staggered. There was no sick pay, no replacement staff. If you didn't open the shop, the day's wages vanished. And sometimes, customers vanished with it off to competitors, or to make do without. Illness wasn't just physical discomfort, it was economic peril. You try to press on. You boil water. You open the shutters. You wrap your shawl tighter and force a smile when a regular asks if you're a bit peaky. But your hands shake while scooping lentils. Your breath wheezes. And when no one is looking, you sit behind the counter and rest your forehead on a sack of oats. Sometimes, family stepped in an older child, managing the till, a spouse taking notes in the ledger with unsure hands. But not always. Some shopkeepers had no one. A neighbor might check in, bring broth offer to fetch deliveries. Others turned away wary of contagion, or simply too busy with their own burdens. There's no agreement among historians on how often communities truly helped. Letters show kindness and cruelty in equal measure. You've heard the stories. A woman down the street closed for 2 days and reopened to find half her customers gone. A man near the bakery caught pneumonia and never opened again. The shop became a cobwebbed relic jars, still half full, chalkboard, still listing prices from February. But you've also heard of resilience. The butcher's apprentice who ran his uncle's shop for a month. The widow who stitched baby bonnets to cover her medicine costs. The boy who delivered tea tins to neighbors when his father couldn't stand. These aren't grand tales. No statues were built, but they're real. You finally do it. You hang a hand-lettered sign, closed today. Apologies. You light a lamp and retreat behind the curtain, curl into a blanket, and sip the weak broth someone left at the door. The shop is still. The street continues. And you let go. And somehow the world doesn't end. Because even in this relentless routine, there's space just barely for weakness, for healing, for the quiet courage of rest. The light outside softens, turning from gold to gray. You move through the shop with slow precision, less from fatigue, more from habit. It's closing time, and every ritual counts. Every sweep of the broom, every rattle of the shutter, every click of the lock whispers you made it through another day. You start by clearing the counter. Biscuit crumbs, string ends, pencil shavings. Into a dustpan they go, while your hand rests briefly on the brass scales. They're tired too. You pat them like an old dog. The jars are sealed. The drawers shut. A stray barley sugar is tucked back into its jar, though you briefly consider eating it instead. Then it's time to count the till. Copper coins, mostly with the odd silver sixpence that feels like treasure. You don't just count money. You weigh it in your mind against the day. Was it enough? Were there too many debts? Too few purchases? Some days it's numbers. Some days it's just feelings. The shutters creak as you pull them closed. Outside, the street has quieted. Dogs have curled up in corners. The last sweet boy jogs past, with his ladder bouncing behind him like a skeletal tail. You watch him go, then slide the bolt across the door. But the day isn't done not truly. You check the back door twice. You stir the fire. You listen. Some shopkeepers kept small weapons nearby, a broomstick, a hatpin, a cricket bat behind the curtain. There are stories of break-ins, though no one agrees how often they occurred. Some say it was rare. Others say everyone had their own, just-in-case story. You keep a heavy book near your bed, not for reading. Upstairs, the children are asleep, or pretending to be. The cat is curled in a box labeled buttons. You peel off your apron and hang it by the stove. Tomorrow, you'll wear it again. Tomorrow, the door will open, the bell will ring, and someone will ask for flour, as though today never happened. But tonight, the shop sleeps. The walls exhale. The lamp dims. You made it. Again. Yet just across town, another bell jingles, and instead of peace, it promises peculiarities. The air smells less of biscuits and more of chalk vinegar and strange tinctures. You've left the general shop behind and stepped into something far more peculiar. You stand in the narrow aisle of a Victorian apothecary, your boots clicking softly on the polished floorboards. A brass bell jingles behind you as the door shuts. On the counter sits a jar of water, dark shapes coiling at the bottom. The label reads, leeches. Live. Your fingers twitch. Leeches weren't just a curiosity, they were a medical staple. Victorian doctors and pharmacists alike believed they could cure a wide range of ailments, from bruises to bad tempers. If your grandmother had high blood pressure, or your uncle complained of too much bile, out came the leeches. They were prescribed with eerie regularity and collected with pride. But the true enthusiasts, those were the home shoppers. Ordinary people, housewives, laborers, traveling salesmen, bought jars of leeches and kept them in their pantries like pickles. Not for dinner, of course, but for emergencies. Some came with linen cloths or mesh lids to keep the creatures alive between uses. You didn't want your medicinal livestock to perish before the next fever. there's something grimly practical about it all. Imagine opening a cupboard and seeing a jar of twitching black worms next to the flour tin. Perhaps one jar for leeches, another for barley. Medicine and breakfast side by side, as one shop ledger joked. Yet for all their popularity, there's still debate among historians about how common leech treatments really were outside of hospitals. Some claim the records exaggerate their use, suggesting that actual application was more limited, confined to towns with skilled apothecaries. Others point to the sheer volume of import records, barrels of leeches arriving from France, Ireland, even Hungary, as proof that they were a Victorian necessity. What's certain is that if you walked into the right shop in 1870 London, you could walk out with a cheerful good day and a jar of living, writhing vampires. From squirming jars to slippery creams, your shopping trip is just getting stranger. One shelf over you find delicate glass bottles labeled snail water and tiny tins marked ant egg paste. No, you haven't wandered into a prank shop. You've entered the beauty aisle. Victorian beauty was a careful, calculated performance, and the ingredients were often pulled from gardens, ant hills, or the occasional ashtray. If you were a woman hoping to lighten your skin, reduce wrinkles, or remove facial hair snail mucus, and ant eggs were just the beginning. Snail water, despite its name, wasn't merely slug juice in a bottle. It involved stewing live snails with beer and herbs, straining the result and bottling the syrupy goo. This supposedly clarified the skin-reduced redness and added luster. It probably also smelled like damp moss and regret. Still, for women facing the harsh beauty standards of the day, it offered a kind of hope, glistening and faintly herbal. Then there was ant egg paste. This odd cream, imported from the Middle East and sold in tiny tins, promised to reduce unwanted hair if applied diligently. Its effectiveness is highly contested. Some believe it was a simple grainy balm, more exfoliant than elixir. Others suspect it was just perfumed oil with a particularly creative label. Either way, it cost far more than a bar of soap, and its instructions often came in multiple languages, as if exoticism itself could boost efficacy. One of the most peculiar beauty tricks involved burnt matchsticks. Char the tip, let it cool, and then draw it carefully along the lash line. Instant eyeliner. Smoky, imperfect, but surprisingly fashionable. Entire columns in ladies' magazines offered tips on how to get the angle just right. Never too sharp, never too dull, advised one. The recipes for these concoctions sometimes survive in dusty household books, tucked between cake instructions and laundry starch techniques. Historians still argue whether these were widespread routines or the indulgences of the upper class. Were they secret rituals, whispered between maids, or did shop girls apply them proudly before the morning rush? There's no scholarly consensus, but one thing is certain. The Victorian woman's vanity table was a minefield of pest-based ambition and aromatic improvisation. The scent shifts again now, a dry, chalky note tinged with something ancient and funerary. You follow your nose past the hair tonics and liniments until you see it a small tin labeled Mumia. Next to it, a packet of blackened crumbs labeled only toast. The Victorians, it seems, had no fear of the macabre when it came to medicine. Ground mummy, yes, real human remains pulverized into dust, was sold as a remedy for everything from epilepsy to internal bleeding. Some apothecaries even mixed it into tonics. The term mumia referred both to natural asphalt and to the desiccated remains of actual Egyptian mummies. One was sticky. The other was, well, surprisingly gritty. It wasn't just curiosity. The belief went back centuries that ancient flesh held potent healing powers preserved by desert sands and sacred oils. Crushed into a fine powder and stirred into wine, it was thought to offer vitality. In reality, it likely offered a strong aftertaste and a moral quandary. Some jars were sold with a note imported from Thebes. Others, less honestly, were made from any old bones the seller could find. Whether buyers knew or cared is a matter of historical debate. Next to this, burnt toast feels oddly comforting. Yet this simple blackened slice was once a respected cure for indigestion. The char was thought to absorb toxins, settle the stomach, and counteract bad humors. A slice of overcooked bread in hot water could serve as a Victorian version of an antacid. No cinnamon, no butter, just carbon. Some even combined the two. One doctor recommended adding mummy powder to toast water to calm the guts and the spirits. Whether that was comforting or deeply unsettling depends on your sensibilities. There's a strange, almost poetic logic to it. The dead in powdered form, bringing comfort to the living. And toast, the humblest of foods, transformed into medicine through nothing but fire and folklore. Medical historians continue to debate whether people truly believed in the powers of mummy dust, or whether it was simply an expensive placebo with exotic appeal. What's certain is this somewhere in a Victorian shop, not unlike this one, a customer handed over coin in exchange for ancient flesh and burnt bread. A sweet scent drifts toward you now, but something about it feels wrong. You follow it to a display of candies nestled in glossy paper and tin boxes. Striped humbugs, barley twists, lemon lozenges, and something called violet drops that look more like pebbles than treats. Victorian children adored sweets. But in a time before food safety laws, some of those vibrant colors came with a dangerous twist. The bright green might have meant copper arsenite, the yellow, possibly lead chromate. A good candy wasn't just sugary, it was radioactive in flavor and alarming in chemistry. Confectioners often prioritized appearance. A prettier sweet sold faster, even if it left your fingers tingling. Red dyes sometimes came from crushed beetles or coal tar derivatives. Parents, shopkeepers, and even school teachers handed them out without knowing the risks, or more unsettlingly, suspecting and choosing to ignore them. One factory in Bradford made lozenges laced with arsenic by accident, mistaking it for harmless filler. 20 people died. The scandal prompted some reform, but only slowly. For years afterward, unregulated sweets remained on shelves. Still, the candy counter drew crowds. Kids clutched pennies and pressed noses to glass, unaware or unbothered that their favorite lemon balls might leave them dizzy. Flavored wax sticks, lollipops with wooden stems, even licorice pipes shaped like gentlemen's cigars. The line between treat and toxin was whisper thin. There are historians who argue that these dangerous candies were the exception, not the rule, that most confections were harmless, if a bit dusty. Others point to import records' chemical supply orders and the growing number of newspaper warnings to suggest otherwise. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: sweetness in the Victorian age came with risk. But in a world of soothe nerves and silent dinners, maybe a risky bonbon was worth the gamble. You move past the candy case and toward a locked cabinet. Inside, delicate bottles shimmer in the lamplight, some dark amber, others milky glass. Their labels are either missing or marked in looping script: laudanum, ratsbane, spirits of hartshorn. The shopkeeper stands nearby, silent but watchful. Poisons in the Victorian era were easily purchased, often without questions. Arsenic, also known as ratsbane, was a staple in many homes. Sold as pest control, it was also used to whiten the skin, treat syphilis, and disturbingly settle certain domestic disputes. A little powdered arsenic in a pie was a recurring theme in crime novels and occasionally in real life. Then there was laudanum, a tincture of opium widely used for everything from headaches to melancholia. Doctors prescribed it with enthusiasm. Mothers gave it to teething infants. Artists swore it opened their minds. And shopkeepers, they stocked it behind the till, sometimes wrapped in ribbon, sometimes not. Victorian poison packaging was paradoxical, sometimes discreet, sometimes almost decorative. Cobalt blue bottles warned of danger with raised glass dots meant for the blind. Yet others were downright pretty, tucked into velvet-lined boxes like perfume. It's unclear how much shopkeepers truly knew about the risks. Some likely understood, but chose to look the other way, especially when regulars came calling for their sleep aid. Others might have believed in the supposed medicinal benefits, unaware of the long-term effects. Surviving ledgers list opium tinctures alongside cough syrup, implying casual familiarity. Scholars remain divided on the culture around poison sales. Was it ignorance, indifference, or just a lack of regulation? Diaries suggest both guilt and necessity. One woman wrote of buying laudanum weekly for her husband's cough, even as his hands began to tremble and his voice slurred. It helps him sleep, she noted. In shops like these, a bottle could mean relief or ruin. And all it took was the turn of a key, a quiet transaction, and perhaps a wink from behind the counter. Tucked beside the apothecary shelf is a drawer marked dental. You expect powder or floss. Instead, the shopkeeper lifts a velvet-lined tray, filled with human teeth. Some are mounted in pinkish gums. Others lie loose like seashells awaiting inspection. Victorian dentistry was often less about medicine and more about acquisition. If you needed dentures, and many did, you had options: ivory, porcelain, or the most economical second-hand human teeth. Extracted, boiled, and reshaped, they were sold to customers desperate for a presentable smile. Many of these teeth came from the poor. Some were bought voluntarily, especially after battles, or in graveyards freshly disturbed. Others were liberated from corpses by grave robbers. The infamous Waterloo teeth taken from fallen soldiers were especially prized for their youth and quality. Shops might advertise them without naming the source, but customers knew, or chose not to ask. Once cleaned, the teeth were set into vulcanized rubber or metal plates and polished until they gleamed. Displayed in shop windows, they looked almost cheerful. Restored confidence boasted the advertisements. A natural smile at half the cost. Of course, not everyone could afford a full set. Some bought partial dentures, or even single replacement teeth tucked into pockets or pinned with wire. One ledger from a London shop includes an entry for upper third incisor, previously owned. Historians debate just how widespread this second-hand trade truly was. Some argue it was a niche market mainly for urban poor. Others point to import records and shipping crates of extracted molars that suggest a far larger demand. What's undeniable is that for many Victorians, a smile was a luxury sometimes made from another person's past. And in shops like this, among jars and powders promising youth, you could buy a stranger's bite. A few steps further, and the scent turns savory. You glance down at a stack of soap bars, unevenly cut and wrapped in brown paper. They're faintly floral, but something lingers beneath, like stew left too long on the hob. The shopkeeper smiles. Best soap in town, he says. You hesitate. Soap in the Victorian era was a gamble. It wasn't always branded, and ingredients weren't required on the label if there was one. The basic formula included fat and lye, but what kind of fat? Well, many soaps were made with tallow, rendered animal fat, often pig. It was cheap, abundant, and easy to mold. If you caught a whiff of bacon during your bath, you weren't imagining it. Some claimed their soaps used only refined ingredients. Others weren't so picky. Stories circulated of soap made from street scraps, mystery meat, and refuse from butcher stalls. The result was often a grayish bar, soft at the edges, that wore down quickly and left hands smelling faintly of broth. To make it more palatable, manufacturers added scent lavender rose lemon verbena. But even these couldn't always mask the stew pot undertone. Diaries from Victorian housewives are peppered with complaint soap that wouldn't lather left stains or caused rashes. One entry simply read, "Smells like dinner," not in a good way. Yet soap was essential. Hygiene was gaining popularity and social pressure demanded cleanliness. Advertisements promised that good soap led to good character. Children were taught that scrubbing was virtuous, and a bar of fragrant, if slightly meaty soap was often part of a young bride's dowry chest. There's ongoing debate among historians about how much customers knew or suspected about the true origins of their soap. Some claim housewives were simply resigned. Others believe many took pride in homemade alternatives, avoiding the mystery bricks from city shops. Whatever the case, one truth bubbles up in the Victorian marketplace. Even cleanliness came with a whiff of compromise. You brush past the soaps, but your hand lingers near a wooden apothecary shelf lined with tiny vials. The labels read, like myth, pulvis unicornubears, grease elixir of serpent root. The bottles glint in the gaslight, promising hair, regrowth, strength, and good fortune. Victorian apothecaries loved the mystical. Powdered unicorn horn, not a joke. Though the horn came from narwhals, its magical reputation persisted. Sold ground or whole, it was thought to neutralize poisons and protect against disease. Wealthier customers sometimes carried a bit in lockets or rings for luck or subtle purification. Then there was bear grease, a popular remedy for baldness. Vendors claimed it stimulated hair growth, especially when massaged nightly into the scalp. Real bear grease, rendered fat from actual bears, was expensive, so most shop versions were lard with scent added. Still testimonials abounded. One gentleman reportedly grew a full fringe within a fortnight. Skeptics muttered that it was more likely comb rearrangement than follicular miracle. The marketing was elaborate. Powder tins featured unicorns rampant. Bear grease jars came with embossed lids. Some apothecaries offered free applications with purchase brushing the salves onto patrons' temples with absurd solemnity. You can almost picture it, a mustachioed man sitting under a lace curtain while a clerk applies warmed grease like it's sacred balm. There's ongoing scholarly debate about how many Victorians truly believed in the ingredients and how many were swayed by branding alone. Some historians suggest that even sellers knew the joke, playing into fantasy for profit. Others point to diary entries full of hope and routine, where customers earnestly tracked progress in front of foggy mirrors. What's clear is that the Victorian medicine cabinet was part science, part theater. In this little shop, belief could be bottled powdered or rubbed in nightly. A quiet shuffle draws your attention to the far end of the shop, where a wire spinner rack wobbles gently under its own weight. You step closer. Its pockets overflow with thin, cheaply printed booklets, each cover more lurid than the last. Bloodied knives, wide-eyed ghosts, pirates with too many pistols. Welcome to the world of penny dreadfuls. For just a penny, Victorians could escape into serialized stories of crime, horror, and scandal. These booklets were mass-produced, folded newsprint with woodcut illustrations and clumsy fonts. Titles like Varney the Vampire, The Mysteries of London, or Sweeney Todd gripped readers across all classes. It didn't matter if the grammar was poor. It was thrilling, and sometimes just plausible enough to feel real. Each installment ended with a cliffhanger. Would the monster strike again? Was the governess secretly a jewel thief? Could the masked highwayman really be a disgraced noble? These questions kept readers returning weekly coins ready and eyes wide. Children hid them under mattresses. Factory workers read them aloud in alleys. Even genteel families sometimes snuck a peek, though they might tuck the booklet behind a more respectable volume should anyone knock. One vicar famously preached against the demon of Drury Lane, only to be found reading it behind his sermon notes. Victorian moralists argued fiercely over the genre. Some believed it poisoned the youth, turning them into criminals, or romantics, or both. Others saw it as harmless fun, an escape for the overworked and underpaid. Better blood, on paper, than in the streets, quipped one satirist. Historians still disagree. Were penny dreadfuls corrupting, or were they the first democratized fiction, bringing storytelling to those who could never afford hardcovers? Whatever their impact, the shop's rack remains crowded. You reach for a copy. The cover reads, "The Tomb Beneath the Butcher's Shop." You can't help but smile. The scent of newsprint lingers as you drift toward a lower shelf, this one draped in soft fabric sachets and curling labels with stars and hearts. A small sign reads, "For matters of the heart, both medical and otherwise." You've reached the love potion section. Victorian shops, particularly the discreet ones, often sold magical goods, powders for attraction cards, for divination charms to win affection or ward off betrayal. These weren't sold loudly. No bells or adverts. Just a knowing nod and a whisper of backshelf, third drawer. The powders came in tiny wax paper envelopes or little tins with velvet linings. Their contents often ambiguous. Love dust. Number 2 might be mostly ground pepper. Venus powder could be clove or something more theatrical. The ambiguity was part of the appeal. Belief did the heavy lifting. Some were brewed into tea. Others were sprinkled on letters or tucked into pockets before a risky rendezvous. One popular product claimed to restore wayward affections in under a fortnight. It didn't say how. The language was deliberately vague, the instructions poetic rather than practical. And then there were the fortune cards, early versions of tarot or lot casting tools sold in painted boxes or folded fans. These were used at gatherings, especially among women, often with candles and gossip. A question was whispered, a card drawn, and a future imagined. Did he love you? Would you travel soon? Would your rival fall ill from jealousy? The answer depended less on fate, more on interpretation. Historians still debate whether these items were taken seriously or simply added sparkle to an otherwise gray existence. Some diaries suggest deep belief, others gentle mockery. I drank it, one woman wrote of her love tea, and he still ignored me, but the flavor was bold. In shops like this, magic mingled with merchandise, and whether or not the spells worked for a penny or two, a broken heart could at least feel occupied. A creaky shelf in the back beckons you, next lined with squat jars and dark bottles, each stuffed with oddly shaped morsels. A small wooden crate labeled pickled walnuts, 3 for a halfpenny rests beside another marked beetroot ale, strong. You've wandered into the Victorian snack aisle. Forget biscuits and tea. For many snacks came brined fermented or bubbling with something unrecognizable. Pickled walnuts, soaked until soft and blackened, were a delicacy, at least according to those who acquired the taste. Paired with cheese or stuffed into pies, they offered a vinegary punch in a world without refrigeration. Beetroot ale, meanwhile, was as vibrant as it sounds, brewed from sugar beet or beetroot itself, sometimes with molasses, sometimes with herbs. It stained your lips, fizzed on the tongue, and left behind a ghost of earthiness. Travelers swore by it. One pamphlet promised it fortified the belly and soul alike. Other snack oddities included preserved cucumbers in malt vinegar, turnip chips baked dry, and even dried apples rehydrated in wine. Each region had its preferences. A dock worker in Liverpool might snack on a pickled egg from a street vendor. A mill girl in Leeds might carry beetroot loaf wrapped in cloth. The idea of a quick bite was as practical as it was peculiar. Cookbooks, from the time those that addressed snacking at all, offered conflicting recipes. One advised boiling walnuts in brine for 7 days. Another insisted on burying them in salt. Neither explained why. Historians continue to argue whether these snack habits were born of scarcity or taste. Were pickled walnuts beloved, or simply endured? Were these foods invented from necessity, or curated indulgences for palates shaped by soot and steam? In any case, here on this shelf, the choices are tangy, pungent, and unapologetically weird. You reach for a beetroot ale and imagine sipping it on a foggy cobbled lane, dodging horse carts and chewing thoughtfully. You take a final swig of beetroot ale, sweet sour, oddly fizzy, and round a dusty corner into the darker part of the shop. Here, the light from the windows fades, and the air feels heavier. On a low wooden shelf sit tiny handcrafted coffins barely longer than your hand, each one carved, sealed, and ominously labeled for misfortune. Welcome to the folk magic aisle. In Victorian superstition, miniature coffins weren't toys. They were talismans of ill-intent curses made solid. Slipping one into a rival's path, burying it near a doorstep, or simply leaving it at a crossroad was believed to bring misfortune, illness, or financial ruin. If someone's luck soured, suddenly neighbors might whisper, "He's been coffined." These weren't sold openly, but word spread. Ask for Auntie's box, some whispered. Others slipped coins into drawers without speaking. The coffins were made of wood, filled with hair wax figures, or tiny notes scribbled in Latin or bad spelling. Some included nail clippings, or bits of ribbon tokens tied to the victim. They weren't always malicious. Occasionally, they served as protection reverse curses to send harm back to its origin. But most were tools of quiet revenge, their power lying not in proven effect, but in belief. If your neighbor believed she'd been cursed, every stubbed toe and burnt pudding became proof. Records are scant, but police reports sometimes mention cabinets of ill articles discovered in back rooms or alleys. One shop inventory in Edinburgh listed child's box lid, painted black price 2D. Scholars still argue whether these were curiosities or tools of active magical practice. The truth may be both. Interestingly, sales of such items often spiked during economic downturns. When jobs vanished and prices rose, people turned to whatever power they thought might shift fate. A coffin for the landlord, a powder for luck, a candle for hope. So you hold the little box in your palm, feel its weight. It's not heavy, but it is serious. And somewhere out there, someone might be waiting for a sign that they've been cursed. From curses to curiosities, your next step takes you toward a refrigerated display case, faintly humming in the gloom. Inside, a pineapple, wrapped in netting, a coconut with twine, still attached a stack of oranges turning slightly soft. Above it, a chipped sign reads, Exotics Weekly, while stocks last. Yes, even in coal-dusted Victorian London, you could sometimes buy tropical fruit. The secret imported ice. Before mechanical refrigeration, huge blocks of ice were shipped from Norway, Canada, or even New England, insulated in sawdust and stored in underground ice houses. This chilly cargo allowed shopkeepers to preserve fragile imports, though not always successfully. A pineapple in January was more status symbol than snack. You might buy it, display it for guests, then pass it on before it rotted. Owning or even renting a pineapple was fashionable. One could pay a fee pose with it during dinner and return it the next day. Photos survive of entire families beaming beside their temporary tropical guest. Oranges and bananas followed their arrival, noted in household diaries and letters. A single orange today slightly bruised, but thrilling, wrote one clergyman. Coconuts often puzzled buyers. A few simply displayed them whole, uncertain how to open or eat them. Some sellers offered coconut opening services for an extra penny. These exotic goods arrived thanks to expanding shipping routes, colonial trade, and a growing appetite for novelty among the middle class. But not all shipments succeeded. One merchant recalled receiving 3 dozen pineapples, 17 of which were already soup. Still, the draw remained strong. Historians continue to discuss whether this trend was driven by true taste or by aspirational display. Some argue Victorians genuinely wanted the flavors. Others suggest it was about appearing worldly, fashionable, even if no one quite knew what to do with a mango. So here, in a back room cooled by foreign frost, you imagine a grocer handing over a nearly frozen banana to a lady in gloves. She smiles as if she's just touched the edge of the empire. The chill fades as you move toward a shelf stacked with round tins, waxed bricks, and heavy glass jars labeled blacking. A dusty display card promises for the shiniest boots and the noblest footsteps. You're now in the land of Victorian shoe care. Boots were more than footwear. They were status symbols. The scuffed boot told one story, the polished another. Shoe blacking in all its forms was a staple product found in home shops and street corners. The most popular forms included blacking balls, dense orbs of polish, bricks wrapped in cloth, and greasy pastes stored in pots with tin lids that snapped shut like a secret. Blacking was usually made from lampblack, a fine soot mixed with tallow or beeswax vinegar, and sometimes turpentine. The smell was sharp, medicinal, and persistent. Polishing was a ritual. A soft cloth, a stiff brush, careful dabs and circles until the leather glowed. Households often assigned children the task. Some made pocket money by polishing neighbors' boots. But there was a risk. Many blacking formulas were highly flammable. Sitting too close to the hearth while applying it could cause the polish to catch fire. One anecdote recounts a man whose boot caught while he warmed his feet. He leapt up, flailing his shoe more dangerous than his pipe. Still shiny boots meant respectability. Street children would form small gangs, roaming with brushes and rags, offering a shine for a farthing. One diary notes a boy who polished 20 boots in a day, enough to buy supper and a sweet. Historians debate whether most families truly use these commercial products or preferred homemade blends. Some claim the commercial brands were more about image than utility, marketed heavily, but rarely bought by the poorest. Others suggest blacking was one of the few luxuries even a struggling home could afford. Whatever the truth, in this corner of the shop practicality met pride. You imagine kneeling by a fire rubbing polish into cracked leather, watching the dullness vanish into gleam. And finally you reach the most curious corner of all. A dusty alcove behind the counter lit by one lone oil lamp holds a crooked shelf of mysterious glass jars. Some are clear, others clouded with age. Most bear no labels. Inside, the contents range from unidentifiable powders to cloudy liquids. And what might just be frog bits? These were the mystery jars, an essential feature in many Victorian shops. They weren't part of the catalog. They weren't advertised. But they were always there, waiting on the back shelf, like strange guardians of forgotten cures. Customers who knew what to ask might receive a nod, and a jar slid quietly across the counter. These concoctions weren't regulated, often homemade, and passed down like folklore. They might contain herbal tinctures, alcohol infusions, or even animal parts preserved in spirits. Some jars were layered with sediment, others thickened at the bottom like old jam. One label, faded and torn, reads simply, "For the rattles." Another bears a symbol instead of words, a crescent moon etched in ink. These codes hinted at the intended use: nerves, sleep, fertility, grief, or possibly just luck. Shopkeepers rarely explained. Buyers rarely asked. Some historians suggest these were placebos for emotional ailments, grief, melancholy, fainting fits. Others believe they were remnants of pre-industrial folk medicine kept alive behind the respectable veneer of the modern shop. Diaries speak of mothers swearing by Mrs. Hensley's gray tonic, though no one ever wrote down what it contained. There's no scholarly consensus on how many people actually used these jars or what was in them, but they appear often enough in inventories and letters to suggest they mattered. In a world of uncertainty, a jar without a name might have offered comfort, or at least the illusion of control. You lean closer, the glass fogging slightly with your breath. The jar doesn't answer your questions. It never has. So now your basket is full of pickled walnuts and powdered unicorns, snail cream, and second-hand teeth, dubious sweets, and darker wishes. You've wandered the aisles of a Victorian shop, not just to browse, but to listen. Each jar and bottle whispered something strange, something very human: hope, vanity, hunger, superstition. The lamp above flickers once more as you step outside back into the gaslit street. Your fingers still smell faintly of soap, or is that stew? Behind you, the shopkeeper returns to their ledger. No questions asked, no receipts given. It's a comfort in its way, knowing that the past had its own absurd routines. Their beauty tricks were bizarre, their medicine a gamble. But the impulse, familiar: to look better, to feel better, to understand life through jars, powders, pamphlets, and a touch of the inexplicable. If this odd stroll through time helped you rest, you're welcome back anytime. These stories stay open after dark, and the shelves never empty. If you'd like to return to stories like this, you can always subscribe quietly, of course. But before you drift off, tell me, what time is it? Where are you listening from? And which forgotten object do you wish you could bring back?